Yeah, I have several cameras that monitor, and then caught myself just in time. I mean, just a smart doorbell camera. Nothing fancy. I corrected quickly, hoping my near slip hadn't been too obvious. The officers examined my receipts and seemed satisfied that I had indeed been several hours away during the time when the incident must have occurred. But just as I was beginning to feel confident that my alibi was solid, Mrs. Henderson provided an unexpected development that I hadn't fully anticipated. While the police were questioning me about my whereabouts, she approached the lead investigator with an old piece of mail in her hand. "Officer," she said, "I feel terrible about this, but I think there's something you should see. I found this old letter when I was cleaning out my mailbox yesterday, and it might be relevant to what happened. Here." She handed him what turned out to be an official warning letter from Babs's previous HOA, documenting a pattern of parking violations and harassment complaints that had led to her removal from her position as HOA president. The discovery of that letter was like a bomb going off in the middle of Bob's accusation against me. I watched as the information spread through the crowd of neighbors like wildfire. I could see Mr. Wilson's expression changed from suspicion to understanding, his eyes shifting from me to Babs with a new perspective. Someone in the crowd muttered, "Another neighborhood. She's turned into a battlefield." And I could hear other whispered conversations starting up around us. "So, this has happened before. She was kicked out of her last HOA. Maybe Derek wasn't the problem after all." The tide of public opinion was turning against Babs in real time, and I had to fight to keep the satisfaction off my face. The police officer read the letter carefully, then looked at Babs with a new expression of skepticism and doubt. "Mrs. Peterson," he said, "this letter suggests that you've had similar conflicts with neighbors in the past. Is it possible that someone other than Mr. Langston might have had a reason to target you?" The implication was clear. Babs had made enemies before, and her current situation might be the result of her own pattern of behavior, rather than some unprovoked attack by me. Reaction to the revelation of her history was immediate and desperate, but she just looked like a desperate person grasping at straws. But the most brilliant moment came when I decided to play my final card: complete cooperation and helpfulness. "Officer," I said, stepping forward with genuine concern in my voice, "if there's anything I can do to help with this investigation, please let me know. I have a full workshop with cutting equipment. If you need any tools for the cleanup." I can't believe someone would do something this extreme to Mrs. Peterson. No matter what disagreements we might have had, I even offered to lend them my plasma cutter to help remove the remaining steel plates. The officers declined my offer, but I could see the impact it had on everyone watching. "Thank you, Mr. Langston," the lead investigator said. "It's clear you have nothing to hide here." Those words were worth their weight in gold. An official declaration of my innocence from law enforcement, delivered in front of the entire community. As the crowd shifted their gaze from her to me and back again, I realized the wheel had turned, and for once, I was the one still standing when it stopped. The elderly resident with the cell phone turned out to be Mr. Williams, who lived in the cabin directly across from Bob's place, and had apparently been a more observant neighbor than anyone realized. As the police continued their preliminary investigation, and Babs continued her increasingly frantic accusations against me, Mr. Williams approached the lead officer with obvious reluctance. "Officer," he said quietly, "I think I might have some information that could be relevant to your investigation. I've been having trouble sleeping lately, and I happened to record some unusual activity a few nights ago." The crowd fell silent as Mr. Williams showed his phone to the police officer. "This video is pretty grainy, but I think someone was welding around that cabin that night. I couldn't see who it was, but the timing seems to match." Just one sentence, but it sent a chill through the assembled crowd and made my heart race. From my position, I couldn't see exactly what was on the screen, but I could tell from the officer's expression that it was indeed something significant. The footage was apparently poor quality, taken in low light conditions from a considerable distance, but it showed some kind of activity around Bob's cabin during the early morning hours, several days earlier. But as the officer studied the footage more carefully, I began to realize that this potential disaster might actually work in my favor. The video quality was poor enough that it was impossible to identify specific individuals, and the timestamp corresponded perfectly with the period when I had documented proof of being at my campground. More importantly, the angle of Mr. Williams' recording meant that it showed activity around Bob's cabin, but not around my own property. So, it couldn't definitively connect me to the welding operation, even if someone could be seen in the footage. The real turning point came when Mrs. Discovery of Bob's history began to spread through the assembled crowd like wildfire. People started sharing their own stories about uncomfortable interactions they'd had with Babs. But instead of a chaotic chorus of complaints, the revelations came in sharp, focused testimonies. She told me I couldn't put morning glory flowers in my front yard because they weren't appropriate for the neighborhood character, said Mrs. Mick. I thought she was just being thorough about community standards. Now I realize she was surveilling it. The revelation that had the most impact came from Mrs. Henderson herself. I have to be honest, she said to the assembled group. Babs has been acting strangely ever since she moved here. She's been taking notes about everyone's activities, documenting when people come and go, and she even asked me to help her file complaints against several neighbors for various rule violations. I thought she was just being thorough about community standards. But now I'm wondering if there was something more concerning going on. This admission created a dramatic shift in the community's perception of what had happened. Instead of seeing Babs as an innocent victim of some random attack, people began to understand that she might have made herself a target through her own behavior. And the show was just getting started. The remote campground where I'd chosen to spend my 10-day vacation was exactly the kind of place I'd always loved. No cell phone service, no internet, and no connection to the outside world except for the basic landline phone in the main office. It was the perfect location for someone who wanted to completely disconnect from civilization and enjoy the kind of peace that had been stolen from me over the past few months. But I'd also brought something else, a small laptop with a wireless connection to the surveillance cameras I'd installed around the lake community. The cabin that had once been her spotlight had become her soundproof box, a quiet place echoing her own choices. The first few hours after my departure were eerily quiet. My camera showed the usual peaceful morning routine of the lake community, neighbors collecting their newspapers, walking their dogs, and heading off to work. Babs's Cadillac sat in its usual position, blocking my driveway, but there was no sign of movement from inside her sealed cabin. But as the morning wore on, and the sun climbed higher in the sky, it became clear that something was definitely wrong. The curtains in her cabin never opened, no lights came on, and most tellingly, she never emerged for her usual morning ritual of checking her mail and surveying her domain, like some kind of suburban dictator. Around noon, I detected the first signs of panic from inside the cabin, and I'll be honest, savored every moment of it. If the legal system required more evidence to allow me access to my own driveway, then I was providing them with a comprehensive case study in steel and consequences. Even with the volume low, I could still hear her panic, chaotic thuds, scattered movement, the sound of someone realizing they were no longer in control. Through the small gaps around the steel plates, I could occasionally see the frantic movement of flashlight beams, as Babs began to understand the full scope of her situation. The sounds gradually escalated from confused exploration to desperate banging as she tried different approaches to breaking through the metal barriers. What struck me most profoundly was the complete reversal of power dynamics I was witnessing. For months, Babs had been the one in control, the one watching and documenting my every move, the one who could manipulate situations to her advantage, while I struggled helplessly against a system that protected her. Now the tables were turned. She was the one experiencing confinement, isolation, and the growing realization that her actions had consequences. The woman who had turned my peaceful retreat into a surveillance operation and parking lot had now found herself in an actual prison of her own making. This wasn't just revenge. This was the universe correcting itself, restoring balance to a situation that had been fundamentally unjust. That evening, I sat by the fire with a tin of stew, watching the screen like a mirror. What she was living, I'd already lived it. Silent judgment, isolation, helplessness. The only difference, I built mine out of hope. She built hers out of ego. Around mid-afternoon, I witnessed something that perfectly captured the poetic justice of her situation. Through my cameras, I could see Babs attempting to throw something through one of the small gaps around the steel plates, probably trying to signal for help or attract attention from passing neighbors. But whatever object she was trying to throw kept bouncing back into the cabin, returned to her, just like she had returned every one of my attempts at reasonable communication. The visual metaphor was perfect. Objects being thrown back at her, like all the warnings, complaints, and boundary-setting attempts she had dismissed and deflected over the months of harassment. The psychological aspect of her situation was probably even more torturous than the physical confinement, and I found myself reflecting on the parallels to my own experience. I had been imprisoned not by steel plates, but by a community that had turned against me based on lies and manipulation. I had experienced that same sense of powerlessness, that same desperate search for escape routes that simply didn't exist. The difference was that my imprisonment had been psychological and social, while hers was physical and immediate. I was once imprisoned by the very community I live in, I thought to myself as I watched the cameras. Now they get to see a physical version of what I experienced, and they can't look away. I wasn't smiling. I wasn't gloating. I was watching nature reset itself with the same focus. I used to watch a crooked beam settle into place under the weight of justice. Meanwhile, I was having the most peaceful and restorative vacation I'd experienced in years, without the constant stress of wondering what new provocation or harassment awaited me at home. I could actually relax and enjoy the natural beauty around me. I spent my days fishing, hiking, and reading, secure in the knowledge that justice was finally being served. Every sunset was more beautiful because I knew that Babs was finally experiencing consequences for her actions. Every quiet evening by my campfire was sweeter because I knew she was learning what it felt like to have someone else control her environment and her freedom. On the third day, something interesting happened that I hadn't anticipated. Mrs. Charlotte Henderson, one of the neighbors who had been friendly with Babs, came by to check on her. I watched through my cameras as Mrs. Henderson knocked on the front door, called out Babs's name, and gradually became more concerned when she received no response. She walked around the cabin, probably noticing the steel plates for the first time, and trying to understand what she was seeing. The expression on her face was priceless confusion, then alarm, then a dawning realization that something very serious had happened. That's when I heard Babs's voice for the first time in days, muffled, but clearly audible through the steel barriers. She was shouting for help, banging on the metal, and trying to communicate with Mrs. Henderson through the sealed cabin walls. Her voice sounded hoarse and desperate, completely different from the confident, condescending tone she had always used when speaking to me. Mrs. Henderson pressed her ear against the steel plate covering the front door, clearly trying to understand what Babs was saying. From my remote surveillance position, I could see Mrs. Henderson's growing alarm as she realized that Babs was trapped inside and needed immediate rescue. The woman who had always been so composed and in control was now reduced to screaming for help like anyone else in a genuine emergency. What fascinated me most was watching Mrs. Henderson's reaction to the discovery. This was someone who had been manipulated by Babs, who had probably heard all sorts of stories about my supposed aggressive behavior and unreasonable demands. But now she was confronted with the physical reality of what appeared to be a very serious and professionally executed operation. You could see the wheels turning in her head as she tried to reconcile the Babs she thought she knew with the possibility that someone had felt compelled to take such drastic action against her. The steel plates weren't just containing Babs. They were forcing everyone who saw them to confront the question of what might drive someone to such an extreme response. Mrs. Henderson's discovery of Babs's predicament triggered exactly the kind of community emergency response that I had anticipated. But it also set in motion a chain of events that would test whether my planning had been thorough enough to protect me from the inevitable investigation. Within an hour of finding Babs trapped in her steel-wrapped cabin, Mrs. Henderson had contacted both the HOA management and the local police department. I watched through my surveillance cameras as the Quiet Lake community suddenly became a hub of activity, with police cars, emergency vehicles, and curious neighbors converging on the scene. The irony wasn't lost on me that Babs, who had spent so much effort documenting my behavior and building a case against me, was now the center of attention in a way she had never intended. The rescue operation was more complex than anyone had expected. The police officers and emergency responders quickly realized that removing the steel plates would require specialized cutting equipment that the local fire department didn't have readily available. They had to call in industrial contractors with plasma cutting tools, which meant that Babs would remain trapped for several additional hours while they organized the proper resources. During this time, the assembled crowd of neighbors and officials stood around her cabin, like observers at some kind of bizarre art installation, trying to understand how such a thing could have happened, and who might have been responsible for such an elaborate and precisely executed operation. When the cutting equipment finally arrived and the rescue operation began in earnest, the scene became even more dramatic. Specialists worked their way through the layers. Meticulous welds sliced open by plasma, like reverse engineering a sealed vault. Babs's muffled shouting from inside the cabin became more urgent as she heard the cutting begin, and I could only imagine her relief at knowing that her ordeal was finally coming to an end. The first opening they created was in the steel plate, covering the front door, and the moment there was a gap large enough for communication, Babs began shouting accusations and demands for immediate action against whoever had done this to her. The moment of her liberation was everything I had hoped it would be, and more. When the steel plate was finally removed from the front door, Babs stumbled out into the daylight, looking absolutely destroyed. "Yeah, I have several cameras that monitor, and then I caught myself just in time. I mean, just a smart doorbell camera. Nothing fancy," I corrected quickly, hoping my near slip hadn't been too obvious. The officers examined my receipts and seemed satisfied that I had indeed been several hours away during the time when the incident must have occurred. My alibi, down to the minute, matched fuel stops, time-stamped credit card transactions, even a fishing license renewal on my phone while I was off-grid. But just as I was beginning to feel confident that my alibi was solid, Mrs. Henderson provided an unexpected development that I hadn't fully anticipated. While the police were questioning me about my whereabouts, she approached the lead investigator with an old piece of mail in her hand. "Officer," she said gently, her eyes full of reluctance, "I feel terrible about this, but I think there's something you should see. I found this old letter when I was cleaning out my mailbox yesterday, and it might be relevant to what happened here." She handed him what turned out to be an official warning letter from Babs's previous HOA. It documented a clear pattern: parking violations, rule obsession, multiple harassment complaints, ultimately leading to her removal from her position as HOA president in her last neighborhood. The discovery of that letter, it was like a bomb detonating in the middle of Babs's already crumbling accusation. I watched as the information spread through the crowd of neighbors like wildfire. Faces shifted, eyes widened. Mr. Wilson's expression changed from suspicion to revelation. His gaze drifted from me to Babs, and I could almost see his mind rearranging years of assumptions. Someone in the crowd muttered, "Another neighborhood. She's turned that into a battlefield too." And then, from another corner, "So she was kicked out of her last HOA. Maybe I wasn't the problem after all." The tide of public opinion was turning against Babs in real time, and I had to fight to keep the satisfaction off my face. The police officer read the letter carefully, then looked at Babs with a new expression: skepticism, edged with doubt. "Mrs. Peterson," he said carefully, "this letter suggests that you've had similar conflicts with neighbors in the past. Is it possible that someone other than Mr. Langston might have had a reason to target you?" The implication couldn't have been clearer. Babs had made enemies before. Her current situation, it wasn't some random act of violence. It might very well be a natural consequence of her own behavior. Her reaction was immediate and desperate. She stood up too quickly, her voice rising with panic. No, this is all part of his plan," she shrieked, pointing at me again. "He's manipulating everyone." But to the crowd, to the police, to everyone watching, she didn't look like a victim anymore. She looked like a desperate woman, grasping at straws. And that's when I played my final card, the one I'd been saving for just the right moment: complete cooperation and helpfulness. "Officer," I said, stepping forward with calm concern in my voice, "if there's anything I can do to help with this investigation, please let me know. I have a full workshop with cutting equipment. If you need tools for the cleanup." I paused, looked around at the crowd. I can't believe someone would do something this extreme to Mrs. Peterson, no matter what disagreements we might have had. And then I offered the final detail: "I even have a plasma cutter you're welcome to borrow, if it helps with removing the steel plates." The officers declined, of course, but I could see it's a flicker in their eyes. The subtle shift in the crowd. "Thank you, Mr. Langston," the lead investigator said. "It's clear you have nothing to hide here." Those words, they were worth their weight in gold. An official declaration of my innocence, delivered in front of the entire community. As the crowd shifted their gaze from her to me, and then back again, I realized something. The wheel had turned, and for once, I was the one still standing when it stopped. But the best part was still coming. The elderly resident who had originally filmed the cabin during the nights leading up to the incident, that turned out to be Mr. Williams. He lived in the little cabin directly across from Babs's and had apparently been a much more observant neighbor than anyone realized. As the police continued their preliminary investigation, and Babs raged on with increasingly frantic accusations against me, Mr. Williams stepped forward, slowly, reluctantly. "Officer," he said quietly, "I think I might have something that could help. I've been having trouble sleeping lately, and, well, I recorded some unusual activity a few nights ago." The crowd fell silent. Everyone watched as Mr. Williams pulled out his phone and showed it to the officer. "This video is pretty grainy," he said, but I think someone was welding around her cabin that night. I couldn't see who it was. But the timing, it lines up. Just one sentence. But it sent a chill through the gathered crowd and made my heart skip a beat. I couldn't see what was on the screen from where I was standing, but I could see the officer's face. And I knew it was significant. The footage wasn't clear enough to identify anyone. Poor lighting, far away, shaky hands. But you could clearly see movement activity around Babs's cabin in the early morning hours a few days earlier. As the officer studied the footage more carefully, I began to realize something. This potential disaster might actually work in my favor. The timestamp on Mr. Williams' video. It matched perfectly with my documented alibi receipts, campground check-in logs, gas station footage, all of it, and more importantly, the angle of his recording only showed activity around Babs's property. Not a single frame of it connected to mine. It couldn't place me anywhere near the welding operation. Even if a silhouette was visible, wasn't me. And then came the true avalanche. Mrs. Henderson's discovery of Babs's HOA history had lit the match. Now the fire spread. People began talking. Quietly at first, then louder, sharper, more confident. She told me I couldn't plant morning glories in my yard, said Mrs. McWalsh. Said they didn't match the neighborhood character. I thought she was just picky. Now I think she was spying on us. She documented everything, muttered another neighbor. Even asked me to report someone for having their Christmas lights up too long. But the comment that shifted everything came again from Mrs. Henderson. Have to be honest, she said, stepping forward to address the group. Babs has been acting strangely ever since she moved here. She's been taking notes about everyone's routines. She even asked me to help her file complaints against other neighbors. I thought she was just thorough. But now I think she was watching us. All of us. That one admission flipped the final switch. No longer was Babs seen as the victim. Now she was the instigator, the antagonist, the woman who had turned a peaceful lake retreat into her own surveillance zone. Her response sealed her fate. She stood up, pointed at me again, and screamed, "Arrest him. That man's a menace to community standards. I warned the board about him. If the HOA won't act, then someone like me has to protect this neighborhood." But nobody was listening to her anymore. Her authority, once so absolute, was gone. She wasn't feared. She was pitied. The lead officer, wariness in his voice, turned to her and said, "Mrs. Peterson, we're going to continue investigating this incident. But I have to tell you that we currently don't have sufficient evidence to charge anyone. The welding was done by someone with professional skills, yes. But the suspect has a documented alibi, and we have no eyewitnesses. What he didn't say, but what was clear to everyone, was this. Her history, her paranoia, her obsession with rules, had created her own enemies." The final blow came when the HOA management representative finally arrived. He listened to the briefings, asked a few questions, and then turned to the officers and said, "We'll be launching an internal investigation. Effective immediately. Mrs. Peterson will not be authorized to make any recommendations on behalf of the HOA." That was it. The diplomatic version of "you're done." She was suspended from her authority. Publicly, the neighbors started to disperse. The emergency vehicles began to pack up. I stood there in my driveway, watching the aftermath unfold exactly as I had hoped. Babs, she was isolated, discredited, and facing the very real possibility of being forced to leave the community altogether. And the investigation, they had nothing on me. No footage, no witness. A perfect alibi. But more importantly, the truth was now out in the open. Everyone had seen who she really was. The aftermath of Babs's rescue and the community's collective realization about her true character unfolded over the following weeks, like a slow-motion collapse of everything she had tried to build in our neighborhood. The woman who had once commanded attention and wielded influence through her complaints and documentation activities now found herself completely ostracized and powerless. The neighbors who had previously listened to her concerns about rule violations and community standards now avoided her entirely, and the few who did interact with her did so with obvious discomfort and suspicion. Her campaign to establish herself as the unofficial authority figure in our lake community had backfired spectacularly. The most visible sign of her defeat came exactly 1 week after her rescue, when a large "for sale" sign appeared in front of her cabin, like a white flag of surrender. The sign was positioned prominently, where everyone in the community would see it, making Babs's retreat from the neighborhood as public and humiliating as possible. I watched from my cabin window as she supervised the installation, with the same meticulous attention to detail that she had once applied to documenting parking violations. But now her obsessive behavior was focused on escaping the community that had rejected her, rather than controlling it. And what made her departure even more satisfying was how quickly potential buyers began showing interest in her property. Within days of the sign going up, I observed multiple families and couples touring the cabin with real estate agents. Their enthusiasm was obvious. These were normal, friendly-looking people who would likely become the kind of neighbors the lake community was meant to have. People who would respect shared spaces, follow basic rules without obsessing over them, and contribute to the peaceful atmosphere, rather than destroying it through harassment and manipulation. During this transitional period, I finally had the opportunity to experience what my lake retreat was supposed to feel like. For the first time in months, I could walk out of my cabin without wondering what new provocation or harassment awaited me. My driveway remained clear and accessible, allowing me to come and go freely without having to navigate around illegally parked vehicles or deal with passive-aggressive territorial displays. Nobody needed to say anything. But one morning, the little no parking sign I had made by hand quietly disappeared, not because anyone was afraid, but because it was no longer necessary. The psychological relief of being able to enjoy my own property without constant stress and conflict was enormous. I started using my kayak regularly, again taking evening paddles around the lake and rediscovering the sense of peace and connection with nature that had originally drawn me to this location. My weekend fishing trips resumed without the anxiety of wondering whether I'd be able to access my gear, or whether some new escalation would be waiting for me when I returned. Even simple activities like checking my mail or working in my yard became pleasant again. But the most rewarding aspect of Babs's downfall was watching how the community's dynamics improved. Once her influence was removed, neighbors who had been walking on eggshells, worried about being reported for imaginary violations or drawn into conflicts, began to relax and interact more naturally with each other. The informal social gatherings that had been disrupted by Babs's presence gradually resumed. Children started playing in shared areas again, without their parents worrying about complaints or being surveilled. The lake community began to remember what it had been like before Babs's arrival. And the final chapter of her story in our community came when the young family that eventually bought her cabin moved in and introduced themselves to the neighborhood. Sarah and Michael Thompson, along with their 2 elementary school children, were everything that Babs had never been: friendly, respectful, genuinely interested in contributing to the community's well-being, rather than controlling it. When they knocked on my door to introduce themselves, they were carrying a homemade pie and wearing genuine smiles. "We're so excited to be part of this beautiful community," Sarah said warmly, "and we hope we can be good neighbors to everyone here." The moment that crystallized everything for me came about a month after the Thompsons moved in. I was preparing to take my kayak out for an evening paddle when young Tommy Thompson came running over with his fishing pole, asking if he could join me for a quick trip around the lake. "Hey, Mr. Derek, are we going fishing today?" he asked with that innocent enthusiasm that only kids can manage. I looked out at the lake, then back at this eager child whose family had brought such positive energy to our community. "Yeah, Tommy," I said. "Today, we're going fishing. And nobody's watching us through binoculars anymore." As we paddled together toward the center of the lake, with the sunset reflecting off the water and the peaceful sounds of evening wildlife surrounding us, I realized that this was exactly the kind of interaction that made lake living special, and exactly the kind of moment that had been impossible during Babs's reign of harassment and surveillance. Looking back at my cabin from the middle of the lake, I could see the clear, unobstructed driveway that had caused so much conflict just a few weeks earlier. The Thompsons' car was parked properly in their own space, and there were no territorial displays or passive-aggressive statements cluttering the shared areas. The last I saw of Babs was through my window. On the morning she finally left for good, she closed the door of her Cadillac with the same decisive snap she'd once used to shut down conversations about her parking behavior. No one came out to say goodbye. No one waved. There was just the sound of her engine starting, and the sight of her rearview mirror reflecting back the image of a woman who had spent so much time scrutinizing everyone else that she'd never bothered to examine herself. As she drove away, I felt a profound sense of closure wash over me. Karen didn't leave because I welded her cabin shut. She left because everyone finally saw who she really was, and that was enough. Justice doesn't always come from the courts or the authorities. Sometimes it comes from the community itself. When people finally see the truth about those who have been making their lives miserable, And sometimes, it comes from one person's willingness to stand up and say enough, in a language that the aggressor finally understands. If you've enjoyed this story of neighborly justice, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And tell me about your own encounters with difficult neighbors. Because in the end, we're all just trying to live in peace. And when someone deliberately and repeatedly disrupts that peace, the community has a right to defend itself. We're QA stories. And this is just one of many unbelievable tales. Catch the next video. We promise it's even wilder.